close. By definition, right? That it would be a statement that if it's just stating something that by definition is true, all triangles have three sides, that would be true by definition, right? We wouldn't have to go out and try to find, get more evidence to see whether or not that's a true statement. It would be self-supported. Okay, and then under logical structure, now we have, by its structure, the sentences, one is going to be affirmed, and the other is going to be denied, or one will be false, one will be true. By logical structure, do you remember those two? Tautology, yeah, and that's, what is a tautology? That's right. So you're basically, in a tautology, you're saying the same thing in the subject and the predicate. They're both saying the same thing. So you're true by definition, and then it would be true in and of itself. By definition would be supported. So okay, and then the other is a self-contradiction, right? Where Apostle Paul was an apostle, and he was not an apostle. You couldn't have it both ways. All right. So with that in mind, now we're going to move on to how these statements are going to relate one to another. So far, we're really getting into a lot of the kind of definitional sort of stuff. And now we're going to be bringing in how these statements and these various kinds of statement are going to come together and relate one to another. And this is where I think the rubber is going to really start hitting the road for you, or meeting the road. So let's go to chapter 9, page 69, and we'll read that, work through this together. Relationships between statements. We now need to examine some relationships between statements. Self-supporting statements and supported statements both can be related to other statements in many different ways. There are four major relationships with which we are concerned. I'll give you what we're going for. There's going to be a square of opposition that we're going to be building that structure. It's going to be a square. So 4 types of relationships. We're going to get these various statements in a place where we're going to sort of mathematically be able to map out certain kinds of statements, whether they work with each other, whether they violate each other. So that's where this is going. Are there contradictions? Are there consistencies in the statements? Those sorts of things that we're going to be looking at. So that's where this is going. So we're going to start putting that together, getting those pieces. So the first relationship that we're going to talk about is consistency. When 2 statements can be true at the same time, we say they are consistent. For example, these 2 statements are consistent. Paul was an apostle, and the Apostle Paul was never in Germany. Can those both be true? The Apostle Paul was never in Germany. Now it's not saying they both are true. Consistency is saying, could they both be true at the same time? Right? They would be consistent, hypothetically. It may be a false statement that the Apostle Paul was never in Germany in reality, but as these 2 statements relate to each other, those could both stand as true statements, and so they would be consistent when compared one to another. Okay, so these statements are consistent because there's no conflict between them. So consequently, they can both be true at the same time. Now, if there's a conflict between the 2 statements, they are inconsistent. For example, we could consider these. The Apostle Paul was never in Germany, and compared that to the Apostle Paul spent his life in Germany. Could those both be true at the same time? No. So those would be inconsistent. Fairly straightforward. It is not possible for both of these statements to be true. If he was never in Germany, then he could not have spent his life there. The statements are therefore inconsistent. Okay, so that's consistency and inconsistency. Now, the second relationship is going to be implication. Two statements are related by implication when the truth of the first requires or necessitates the truth of the second. I'll read that again. Two statements are related by implication when the truth of the first requires or necessitates the truth of the second. If statement P implies statement Q, and if statement P is true, then statement Q must also be true. Here's an example. P, all Christians are followers of Jesus. Q, some Christians are followers of Jesus. So if P is true, all Christians are followers of Jesus, it would imply that some are true, right? So I think the word imply is easier to get than implication. But that's really what the word's built upon, the idea of implying that there's a truth in the second statement, because that's just, bottom line is a subset of all, isn't it? So if it's true of the whole, the part must also be implicated in that. Okay. So he who says P must also say Q. This is because P implies Q. It would not be possible for someone to maintain that all Christians were followers of Christ, but that on the other hand, some were not. Many students of logic get confused over the use here of the word some. In common conversation, we tend to contrast some with others. That is, to say some Christians are followers of Jesus Christ implies we think that other Christians are not followers of Jesus Christ. But in logic, when we say that some are P, some S are P, we are saying nothing about whether other S are P. So if I could put in your mind a circle. In Venn diagrams, you may have used Venn diagrams. Some S are P. If you have part of that circle and your S is here, you're saying some are something bigger. All you're dealing with is that part of some. You're not addressing the aspect that is outside that particular consideration, that portion of the circle. Some S are this thing. You're not saying that something outside of that it doesn't enter into the consideration. We're just talking about what is affirmed in that case, right? The truth implied. So, and then in logic, just for your edification, this will become apparent, but S and P will be used as subject and predicate. So that's how this is going to be used. He doesn't actually state that clearly at this point, but that's what we're going to be putting into these statements. Some, whatever your subject is, are the predicate. The last bit here, notice that if two statements are related by implication, then they are also necessarily consistent. Is that clear? If the truth of P implies the truth of Q, they're necessarily consistent, because consistency is saying they can both be true at the same time. In this case, we're saying they are both true. So if they are true, then they certainly potentially could be true as well, right? It's a stronger statement in implication. So they're both consistent and they imply one another. Raise your hand if that's not clear. Okay, good. Okay, logical equivalence is going to be the third relationship. If two statements are logically equivalent, then the first must imply the second, and the second must imply the first. If they are logically equivalent, then both statements must be true or they must be false. See, you could imply the falsehood of something as well, right? Okay, it is not possible for one to be true and the other to be false. For example, we may look at these. No Christians are Buddhists, and no Buddhists are Christians. If P is true, then Q must also be true. And if Q is true, then P must be true. They both imply the other. In this case, they are both true. It is true that no Christians are Buddhists, right? Those are mutually exclusive categories. Okay, but now, look at what happens if you substitute a different kind of word. Like in this case, he's going to use the example of Americans. If you substitute in that P and Q the word Americans for Buddhists, then both statements would have been false. It is false that no Americans are Christians. That would be false. And it must also be false that no Christians are Americans. You see how by substituting that for Buddhists, then the statements become false. So same structure, but the type of word that's used is going to give you a different truth value, right? Yes, ma'am.
So then those two statements are consistent, and those two statements are implied. That was the previous one, right? Implication?
Yeah.
Okay. And they are logically equivalent. Would they be all three of those things?
No Christians are Buddhists could be true, and no Buddhists are Christians could be true. So that would be consistent. And then with Americans, no Americans are Christians could be true, at the same time that no Christians are, what did I say? No Americans are Christians, and no Christians are Americans. They could technically both be true, so yeah. Or false. So you could have consistency, you could have implication, and in this case they're equivalent, yeah. Good. Sure.
What are you using P and Q to represent?
Yeah, that doesn't have a particular word. That's just a symbol, like in mathematics. But for the statements, the statements will be boiled down to all SRP, no SRP, and there you're using whatever you're going to have as your subject and your predicate. Yeah, that's how those are. Yeah. But P and Q are just symbols for identification of two statements that are together. Okay, so similarly, two statements are logically equivalent. Could be like some mammals are egg layers, and some egg layers are mammals. Statements either in the form of no S is P or the form some S is P are equivalent to the statements produced when the subject and the predicate of each are reversed, which is what we have in the example above, right? We will consider these and other types of equivalent statements in more detail. So the two statements that can be equivalent, he's given you an example of the no SRP in the one above and the some SRP in the one below as the two types of statements that can have logical equivalency. Okay, so you have an example of each. Okay, 4, independence. If the truth or the falsity of one statement has nothing at all to do with the truth or falsity of another statement, we say they are independent. There are 2 indications we may use to help determine if statements are independent. First, neither statement can imply the other. And second, the statements must be consistent. In other words, neither statement can necessitate the truth of the other statement, which would be implication, and neither statement can necessitate the falsity of the other, which would be inconsistency. So here we have 2 statements that are independent. All Christians have had their sins forgiven, and all tricycles have 3 wheels. You can see how those don't relate to each other. Both could be true, right? But they don't imply one another. There's no connection that way. Okay, if one statement implies another, then the 2 are not independent. If one statement contradicts another, then the 2 are not independent. In this case, neither statement implies the other, and neither statement conflicts with the other. So the truth value of one has no impact on the truth value of the other. Hence, these statements are independent of each other. So now all relationships can be organized as shown. The relationships between statements, we have 2, consistency and inconsistency. Can they both be true? If they can both be true or false, then we have 2 relationships there, implication and independence. It's possible that they don't relate to each other and can both be true, or they do imply the truth or falsity of the other, and they are connected. And then under the implication, we can have equivalence, where the subject and the predicate can be reversed to establish that the first implies the second and the second implies the first. So where both implication works both directions. Okay? So we'll expand this chart as we learn about other relationships. So the 4 basic relationships are consistency, implication, logical equivalence, and independence. So consistency, implication, logical equivalence, and independence. Logical equivalence, yeah. So okay. You want to go through exercise 9 together then? Okay, so let's start with the following 5 sets of statements. Circle yes if the statements are consistent, and circle no if they are not consistent, right? So in consistency, we're looking for both can be true at the same time. The sun is hot, the moon is white. Are those consistent? Yes, they are consistent. Both could be true. Paul was the author of Romans. Peter was the author of Romans. That would not be consistent, right? Good, okay. Sally told a lie once. Sally usually tells the truth. Those would be consistent, yeah? If she usually tells the truth, yeah, they could both, yeah. All fish have fins. Some fish do not have fins. What's that? Not consistent. Yeah. Inconsistent. Okay, God knows all things. God does not know all things. Inconsistent. Okay. For the next 5 sets of statements, circle yes if the first sentence implies the second, and no if it does not. God created everything. God created porcupines. Yes. All watermelons are green. Some watermelons are green. Yep. Anybody not tracking? That's not. How would that be a no? If it's true that all watermelons are green, would that imply the truth that some watermelons are green? Do you see that now? Yeah. What were you? Yeah. Either all are or some are. Right. So, in the technical sense, if it's true that all watermelons are green, yeah, it wouldn't be true that only some are green. But we're dealing with only the portion of what is affirmed, and in this case, some are green. That would also have to be true, right? So, yeah. Yeah, that's probably going to catch people, and I struggled with this the first time I went through logic, and I'm getting a good refresher on some things, but the first time through, some SRP, I kept wanting to think, well, that means some S are not P. Some SRP, it could be true that all SRP. If you're just saying some SRP, some squirrels are brown, it might be true that all squirrels are brown. But if we're just saying some are, that's all we're affirming. So in this case, if all are, you're going from the bigger category into the smaller. And if it's true of the whole, it's got to be true of that, the subset in this case. The quantity, it's affirming the quantity.
So all of them, and therefore some of them have to.
Right. Yeah, you're going from the bigger to the smaller. It would be hard to prove if some watermelons are green, then implying that all must be green. From that, you couldn't get there, right? But you can get to the smaller, yeah. Okay, honey is sweet. I hate honey. No, that wouldn't imply you're laughing. That's great. Yeah, it is funny. Okay, the Bible is the Word of God. Ecclesiastes is the Word of God. Yeah, that does imply. Okay, some trees are tall, all trees are tall. No. Yeah, for the same reason in our example of the watermelons. Okay. Now seek to determine whether the statements in these sets are logically equivalent. If they are equivalent, circle Y, and if not, circle a no, or N. No Baptists are Americans. No Americans are Baptists. Are those equivalent? That would be. Yep. All dogs are four-legged animals. All four-legged animals are dogs. I mean, you see the structure that they are there, but they wouldn't be equivalent in this case.
That would be because it's all of them. Instead of saying no or some, it's saying all of them are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there are more than dogs that fit in the four-legged animal group, right? Dogs are a subset of that. So, okay. No apples are oranges. No oranges are bananas. Are those equivalent? No. Correct. They're not. So, because you don't have, you have apples and bananas are the difference there, right? What's that? Yeah, you've got 3 terms instead of 2. Okay, 14. Some apostles were scripture writers. Some scripture writers were apostles. Yes. Okay. And then no windmills are giants. No giants are windmills. Yes. Okay. Last, examine these sets to determine independency. Circle yes if the statements are Y if they are independent, and no if they are not independent. The typewriter is broken. Obadiah is my favorite book. Are those independent? Independent, yeah. Logic is hard, Spanish is hard. Independent. God created all the stars, God created this star. No, that would not be, because those do imply one another, don't they? Some triangles are yellow, some tricycles are red. That would be independent. Alan wrote this poem. Alan has written no poems.
No, I'm not independent.
Not independent. Yeah, very good. All right. So let's see. We've got 15 more minutes, and my goal was to get through 2 more chapters in 15 minutes. Probably not going to happen, huh? All right. Let's go through chapter 10. Consistency and disagreement. Sometimes the consistency of statements is difficult to determine. 2 statements may appear to be inconsistent, but upon close examination, they turn out to be consistent. When there appears to be inconsistency, we have disagreement. There are 3 kinds of disagreement that concern us here. There are real disagreements. This is an actual inconsistency. Both statements cannot be true at the same time. For example, Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is not the Son of God. Between these 2 statements, there is real disagreement. Jesus cannot be both the Son of God and not the Son of God. There may be an apparent disagreement. Apparent disagreements are frequently the result of differences of opinion or perception. For example, Smith says, "I think logic is easy," and Jones says, "I think logic is the hardest course I've ever taken." Of course, there's no true disagreement here. Both statements are self-reports, and both can therefore be taken as true without contradiction. It can be true that Smith thinks logic is easy at the same time that Jones thinks logic is hard. There is a difference of opinion, but there is no logical contradiction. Follow? And then third, verbal disagreement. When different definitions are used for the same word, that is, when words are vague or ambiguous, verbal disagreements can result. This does not necessarily mean that there is true inconsistency. For example, Murphy says 1/5 of all high school graduates are illiterate. Johnson says 1/3 of all high school graduates are illiterate. So could it be true that 1/3 of all students are illiterate? If that was true, could it also be true that 1/5 of them were? Yeah, sure. Because smaller number. Okay, the difference between Murphy and Johnson certainly looks like an inconsistency, but the key question here concerns the possible definitions of the word illiterate. Suppose Murphy intends the word to mean those who cannot read at all, and Johnson means those who cannot read past 2nd grade level. If they are not careful, they might find themselves in a 45-minute debate before realizing that they don't really disagree. Okay, because of the possibility of verbal disagreements, it is extremely important to define terms in the first part of any debate. You want to argue about substance, not just words. Consider the following question. If a tree falls down in the forest and nobody hears it, does it make a sound? Some would say yes, and others would say no, but their disagreement would almost certainly be based upon how they are defining the word sound, right? It sounds something you perceive, or it sounds something that moves molecules in such a way that it can be perceived, by our ears. So, yeah, you'll find that when you get into debates, how important that is to define the terms. Okay, I'm going to skip that exercise there. I think that's fairly straightforward. Are there any questions on any of that? Easy cheesy. Then one last lesson that we should get before we close is that when we're dealing with statements in logic, we're going to try to get this boiled down to one basic verb, and that's what we learn in lesson 11. So with the approach to statements, the categorical logic, we are taking in this text, there is only one verb that needs to be mastered. This verb is the verb of being. That is, are, was, were, will be, and so on. Although it may seem awkward at first, this is done to help us analyze statements more easily. I'm going to pause there for a moment. Logic is going to get to that place where we're going to be able to take statements that people say, common language, and really get almost to a mathematical equation using English in a more mathematical way. If we get this one verb, there's a consistency to the form that's going to help us to plug that into the formulas that we're going to use in logic. So if you don't like English and you like math, that's going to be refreshing. If you like English instead of math, that may be intimidating. But I relate to math more than English. So, okay. Instead of saying no cows eat meat, we would change the verb to say no cows are meat eaters. So another example, John will run swiftly. We're going to change that into a subject and predicate with the verb will be. So John will be a swift runner. Okay, so it sounds a little bit awkward at first, but this will make sense as we go through this. As statements are placed into arguments, it is helpful to avoid the verbs of ordinary conversation. This makes analysis of the argument simpler, but it does not mean that there are no pitfalls. Even the word is can carry different definitions. Consider the following. God is love. Love is blind. Ray Charles is blind. Therefore, Ray Charles is God. Right? If is the equal sign in the mathematics, you can see there's a shifting of how God is love gets subtly changed through that course. Okay? So we have to be careful. There's an obvious problem here, but where is it? The argument is fallacious because it treats each use of the word is as though it were an equal sign. A equals B, B equals C, D equals C, therefore D equals A. But is does not always have this meaning as we see here. What does is mean in each of those statements? Here is another ordinary statement. My little brother throws rocks. To change statements like this into standard form, use the following procedure. Number one, identify and write down the entire subject. In our example, the entire subject is my little brother. Choose the proper to be verb. Consider the number, singular or plural, of the subject and the tense, past, present, or future of the verb. My little brother is singular, and the verb throws is present tense, so the proper to be verb is. So now we're going to rewrite the predicate as the predicate nominative, i.e. noun. In this case, the predicate throws rocks becomes a rock thrower. So the whole proposition becomes my little brother is a rock thrower. So my little brother throws rocks is now my little brother is a rock thrower. So here's an example that is slightly more awkward. The Apostle Paul rebuked Peter at Antioch. So we're going to put that in its form, and that would then read, the Apostle Paul was a Peter at Antioch rebuker. Do you follow? Note that in the above example, the tense of the verb is reflected in the verb of being. The original statement is in the past tense, so the verb was is used. As you translate the sentences in the exercises, try to maintain the tense. And now we go right into practical application. The logic student works on exercise 11 would become, what would that be? The logic student works on exercise 11 doer, worker. Actually, would be a exercise 11 worker, would be the way you would do that. The logic student is a exercise 11 worker.
Or will be an exercise.
Yeah, or will be. Next week. Okay, the summary. In order to help us analyze statements and arguments, we must translate the statement so that they use only one verb of being: is, are, was, were, will be, etc. To do this, you should identify and write down the entire subject, choose the to be verb that matches the subject and predicate, and rewrite the entire predicate as a predicate nominative. So we got 5 minutes. So let's try to do exercise 11, and that will give us an end to the this particular section. We'll move on to a different aspect. So, yes, ma'am.
Isn't am a B verb?
Yes. Is, am, are.
Am is our was a verb.
Yeah. Okay, so rewrite each sentence using no verbs but the verb of being. So John eats turnips.
John's the turnip eater.
Very good. John is a turnip eater. Rebecca reads her Bible daily. Very good. A daily Bible reader. Yeah, I think that's what he said, didn't he? Did I not hear him? Is it? Yeah, a daily. Yeah, I thought he said that. Okay. Paul resisted Peter and Barnabas. Very good. Susan works hard to resist temptation. Yeah, I think you could do that. So the subject is what? We're going to write that subject out. Susan, yeah. And the verb? Works is present tense, right? So we're going to use the verb is. Yeah. So is, you could put a hard to resist temptation worker, or Susan is a person who works hard to resist temptation, I suppose, something like that. Okay. Faith produces fruit. What would that be? Very good. The works of the sinful nature lead to death. The works of the sinful nature lead to death. What's the subject? The works of the sinful nature, right? That, yeah, so that would all be in terms of a subject, right? Correct? It's a prepositional of, isn't part of the subject. See, this is why I like math. I like math better than English, and now you see why. Okay.
They usually just don't have prepositional phrases.
Okay. But that would go with, that would be attached to the subject. So then lead is the verb here, correct? And that's going to be in the present tense. So the works of the sinful nature are to death leaders. Yeah. Yeah. To.
Because if you say to death leaders, you're back either to
A prepositional phrase that introduces, yeah. Leaders to death could be, to death leaders or leaders to death. Okay. The donkey rebuked the prophet. Yeah, or in this case, probably was as opposed to is, because rebuked is in the past tense, right? But very good. The man will sing loudly. Very good. Absalom rebelled against King David.
Absalom was a King David rebeller.
Yeah, or an against King David rebeller, right? To get the whole. Okay, God created heaven and earth. Yeah, God. Yeah, that's the challenge. If you say God was, here's where, yeah, that, yeah, yeah. Yeah. This does get you, the answer they put here, which really does open itself to criticism. God is the creator of heaven and earth, but created is in the past tense. So God was the creator of heaven and earth, or God was a heaven and earth creator, would be the way you'd do that. So anyhow, yeah, you got it. So that is going to bring us to the end of this section, and we'll start looking at standard categorical statements next week. Okay, are there any questions on that? This square of opposition is going to be super fun. Yeah, it's going to be fun. I hope. I really like
I
it.
just missed, in the disagreement, we had 3 types of disagreement.
Yep. Real, apparent, and verbal disagreements. Mm-hmm. Apparent and then verbal. He gives the example, Jesus is the Son of God, and Jesus is not the Son of God. You're using the exact kind of subject and predicate. They're exactly the same, but you have a contradiction between an affirmative and then a negative. So an apparent disagreement would be Jesus is the Son of God, or Jesus is God, and Jesus is man. That would be an apparent disagreement, right? But it's not a disagreement. Okay? All right. Okay, someone want to close us in prayer real quick? Joey, you want to? You knew it was going to happen, didn't you? You haven't said anything all lesson, so we pick one.
Father, we thank you